I remember the exact moment I made that promise, not because it was dramatic on the outside, but because something inside me quietly broke and then reassembled itself in a different shape. I told my son I wouldn't cry, not because I stopped feeling, but because I thought strength meant silence, and love meant holding everything in so tightly that no one else would feel the weight of it. But tonight, as I sit in a room that feels too still, I realize something I never wanted to admit out loud. Promises like that don't protect the people you love. They only hide how much you are struggling to stay steady when everything inside you is shaking. And I need you to understand, this is not a story I plan to share. It is something unfolding in real time, something I'm still trying to make sense of while my hands refuse to stop trembling. It started earlier today with a message I did not expect, a message that carried no emotion on the surface, but somehow felt heavier than words should ever feel. There are moments in life when silence between sentences is louder than any confession, and this was one of them. My son didn't say much. He never does when something is wrong, but I know him in the way only a mother can, in the pauses, in what is missing, in the way his voice doesn't quite land where it usually does. And I kept staring at the screen longer than I should have, because I felt something shifting, something I could not name, like a door quietly closing somewhere I was not ready to lose access to. I want to tell you I stayed calm, that I handled it with the kind of emotional discipline people expect from me, but that would not be entirely true. I sat there reading the same line over and over, convincing myself there must be another meaning, another explanation that didn't involve fear. But fear has a way of entering slowly, politely at first, and then suddenly it is sitting right beside you, breathing the same air, asking questions you are not prepared to answer. And I found myself doing something I rarely do. I stopped thinking like someone who understands systems and outcomes, and started thinking like a mother who is simply afraid of losing time. There is a specific kind of helplessness that arrives when you realize you cannot fix something immediately, no matter how intelligent, experienced, or prepared you are. I have spent my life solving problems, navigating uncertainty, rebuilding after setbacks, but nothing prepares you for the kind of uncertainty that involves your own child. And I kept telling myself to breathe, to stay composed, to not let emotion cloud judgment, but emotion was already there, sitting quietly behind every rational thought, waiting for the moment I would stop resisting it. I should have called him immediately, but I didn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of what I might hear in the silence before he answered. Instead, I did what I think many people do when they are scared of a truth they cannot yet face. I started remembering everything, every conversation, every small change in tone, every moment I might have overlooked. And the more I remembered, the more I began to question something I had always taken for granted. How well do we ever really know the people we love when they start carrying things alone? And now I need to ask you something, not as a performer of stories, not as a voice in a script, but as a human being sitting with a question that has nowhere to go. Have you ever looked at someone you love and suddenly felt like there is an entire part of their life you were never invited into, even though you thought you were close enough to see everything? Because that is what this feels like standing outside a room you used to enter freely, now realizing the door has been slowly changing shape without you noticing. I don't want you to think this is only about fear, because there is something else underneath it, something more complicated. It is the realization that love does not prevent distance from forming, it only makes you more sensitive to it. And when that distance appears, even slightly, even quietly, it becomes unbearable in ways that are hard to explain. I kept asking myself if I missed something important, a sign, a moment, a warning I dismissed because life was moving too fast. And that question alone is enough to unravel even the most composed mind. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I caught myself remembering my promise again. I said I wouldn't cry in front of him. I said I would stay strong. But strength suddenly feels like a very thin line between control and collapse. Because what do you do when being strong means pretending you are not afraid of something you cannot yet understand? And worse, what do you do when you realize that your strength might be making it harder for someone you love to tell you the truth they are carrying? I want to tell you there is a clear answer forming, but there isn't. There is only this growing awareness that something is happening beneath the surface, something I am being forced to approach carefully, step by step, without knowing what I will find when I get closer. And I hate that feeling more than anything. Not because I cannot handle truth, but because I cannot protect my son from it if it turns out to be heavier than I expect. If you are still here listening to me, I want you to know this is not just about my family. It is about every moment you assume you have time to say something later, every conversation you postpone, because life feels stable enough right now, because I thought I had more time too. I thought distance was something that only happened to other people, not something that quietly grows inside your own home while you are busy believing everything is fine. And maybe that is why I am speaking to you like this, because there is something about silence that makes fear grow louder, and I cannot stay inside it alone anymore. I promised him I would not cry, and I still intend to keep that promise when I face him, but I did not promise I would not feel everything leading up to that moment. And right now, I feel too much, too fast, too deeply to pretend otherwise. If you are watching this from somewhere right now, I want you to tell me where you are, because strangely enough, knowing there are people listening makes this feel less like I am speaking into an empty space and more like I am not completely alone in this uncertainty. And if this story is reaching you in a quiet moment, I want you to stay with me, because I am not finished understanding what is really happening yet, and I think what comes next will change the way I see everything I thought I understood about him. I will be honest with you. After reading that message, I noticed something I cannot ignore, something small but unsettling, something that makes me question whether this is only about distance or something far more serious beginning to unfold, and I still have not called him back, not because I don't want to, but because I'm afraid of what he might say first. I did not sleep after that, not because I couldn't, but because something in me refused to disconnect from the moment that message arrived, as if my mind believed that if I stayed alert long enough, I could somehow rewrite what it meant. There is a strange phase between fear and acceptance, where your body continues functioning normally, but your thoughts begin moving in circles so tight that even breathing feels like a decision. I sat in that space for hours, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the same silence over and over again, trying to extract meaning from what was not being said. At some point, I stood up and walked through the house without purpose, not looking for anything, not even knowing what I hoped to find. Everything looked unchanged, ordinary, almost offensive in its normality. A glass left on the counter, a light slightly dimmer than usual, the kind of quiet that should feel peaceful but instead feels suspicious when your mind is no longer willing to accept peace as evidence of safety. And I remember thinking something I didn't want to think. Sometimes the world continues to behave normally, even when something important has already shifted underneath it. I told myself I would call him in the morning. That was the agreement I made with my own hesitation, not avoidance, just delay. That is how we justify fear when we still want to believe we are in control of it. But morning did not bring clarity. It only brought a sharper version of the same uncertainty, as if the night had not softened anything, but only compressed it into something denser, heavier, harder to ignore. When I finally held my phone, I noticed something small that unsettled me more than I expected. The contact name, the last time we spoke, the timestamp that should have felt routine, but suddenly felt like evidence of distance measured in hours I had not properly accounted for. I keep thinking about how time behaves differently when something is wrong. It doesn't move faster or slower, it simply becomes noticeable, Like a background process you suddenly realize has been running without your attention. I called him, and I wish I could tell you that it was immediate, that he answered right away, that the story moved forward cleanly from there. But real life is never interested in emotional timing. It stretched. It paused. It forced me to sit with each ring like it was a separate decision I had to justify. And somewhere in that waiting, I realized something uncomfortable. I was no longer afraid of the situation alone. I was afraid of how quickly I could lose the version of him I still believed I understood. When he answered, his voice came through like it had traveled a longer distance than usual. Not weaker, not broken, just slightly misaligned with the version of him I was used to. There are subtle shifts in tone that no one else would notice, but a mother notices them the way a musician notices a single off note in a familiar melody. And I knew immediately that I was not entering a normal conversation. I tried to stay composed. I really did. I asked the kind of simple questions people ask when they are trying to build a bridge back to normality. How are you? Are you eating properly? Are you sleeping? The questions that sound ordinary but carry underneath them an entire weight of unspoken concern. And he answered them in the same way people answer when they are trying to protect someone from the truth without lying directly. Short, controlled, careful. And then there was a pause, not long enough for someone else to notice, long enough for me to feel it in my chest. That pause changed everything. Because in that silence, I understood something I had been refusing to acknowledge. He was deciding how much of himself to let me see, and I was suddenly no longer inside his certainty. I was waiting outside it. I asked him if something was wrong, and he said no too quickly. That is the moment I knew the truth was not absent. It was contained. There is a difference between nothing being wrong and something being held back. One is peace. The other is pressure. I did not push immediately. That is another thing people misunderstand about emotional intelligence. Silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes it is observation. I listened instead. I listened to everything around his voice, not just the words, the pacing, the hesitation between sentences. The way he chose what not to say with more care than what he actually said. And then, almost casually, he mentioned something about work. Something small. Something that should have passed as normal. But it didn't. Because embedded inside it was a detail that did not belong to the version of events I had assumed. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was subtle enough that most people would have missed it entirely. But once you notice a contradiction in someone you love, it does not disappear. It multiplies. I remember my hand tightening around the phone, not because I wanted to control the conversation, but because I suddenly felt like I was standing on unstable ground. Every sentence after that felt like it had two meanings, one spoken, one hidden underneath. And I asked him again, this time, differently. Not what is wrong, but what are you not telling me? There was a shift in his breathing that I will not forget, that small intake of air that happens when someone realizes the conversation has crossed an invisible line they were hoping would never be reached. And in that moment, I felt something I have felt only a few times in my life, the presence of a truth that is about to arrive whether I am ready or not. He said my name. Just my name, not as a greeting, as a warning. And then he told me something I was not prepared for, not because it was loud or catastrophic, but because it changed the context of everything I thought I was looking at. It reframed the silence, the message, the hesitation, the delay in a way that made me realize I had been interpreting shadows without seeing the object casting them. I cannot repeat it to you yet. Not because I am hiding it from you, but because I am still trying to understand what it means myself. And that might sound impossible. But there are truths that do not arrive fully formed. They arrive like fragments, like broken reflections that only make sense when you stop trying to force them into one shape. All I will say is this: it had nothing to do with distance, and everything to do with something I did not know was already in motion, and suddenly my promise not to cry felt irrelevant, because I was no longer dealing with emotion, I was dealing with consequence. After the call ended, I stayed completely still for a long time. I did not move. I did not speak. I think part of me was waiting for the room to confirm that what I heard had actually happened. There is a strange delay in the brain when reality changes too quickly. It continues expecting the previous version of the world to reload, like a system refusing to accept that the file has already been overwritten. But nothing reloaded. And that is when I noticed something I had not noticed before. A second message, unread, sitting quietly beneath everything else, time-stamped earlier than the call. I had missed it, or maybe I had seen it and not understood its importance at the time. My hands did not move immediately to open it. That hesitation was not fear alone. It was intuition. The kind that tells you that once you open something, you cannot return to the version of yourself that hasn't seen it yet. And I kept thinking about my son's voice saying my name like that, not like a child reaching for comfort, but like someone standing at the edge of something they cannot step back from, alone. The message is still there, waiting. And I am still not sure if I am ready to read it, because something inside me already understands that once I do, there will be no going back to the version of this story where I still believed I had time to stay strong without breaking. And I am beginning to realize something even more terrifying than fear itself. This was never just about him needing me. It might be about me being the only one who can no longer stay out of it. And I have not opened the message yet, not even now. I opened the message at a time I cannot even properly name because it did not feel like a normal moment in the day anymore. It felt suspended, like the world had paused its own breathing just long enough for me to cross a point of no return without fully realizing I had done it. There is a strange kind of clarity that arrives right before emotional impact, not during it, not after it, but in that thin space where your mind quietly understands that whatever comes next will not allow you to remain the same version of yourself that started reading. The message was short in a way that felt almost cruel. Not because it lacked detail, but because it contained just enough to force my imagination to do the rest, and imagination is always more brutal than reality when it is left unregulated by truth. I remember reading it once, then again, and then a third time, not because I missed anything, but because I was trying to find a version of it that hurt less depending on interpretation. But there wasn't one. And in that moment, something in me shifted from uncertainty into recognition. Not clarity, recognition. There is a difference. Clarity explains, recognition changes you. It was not about a single event anymore. It was about a chain, a sequence of things I had not seen because I had been looking at him as someone I needed to protect, rather than someone who might already be navigating something I could not interrupt without making it worse. And suddenly, every hesitation in his voice made sense, in a way that felt unbearable. I sat down without realizing I was standing, the phone still in my hand, heavier than it should have been, as if information itself has physical weight once it crosses a certain emotional threshold. My breathing became something I had to consciously manage, not because I was panicking outwardly, but because my body had started reacting to meaning before my mind had fully finished processing it. And then came the second wave. Not the message itself, but what it implied, because it confirmed that what I had sensed was not distance, not misunderstanding, not emotional drift. It was involvement. My son was not drifting away from me. He was standing inside something I had not seen forming, something that had already begun shaping consequences before I even realized it existed. I want to tell you, I reacted like someone trained for pressure, like someone who understands complexity and uncertainty. But the truth is simpler and far more human. I did not react immediately at all. I froze in the most functional way a person can freeze, still conscious, still aware, but temporarily disconnected from the ability to choose what comes next. And in that silence, one thought kept repeating itself with increasing force. If I had known earlier, would anything have changed? That question is dangerous, because it pretends that hindsight is actionable, when in reality, it is only emotional punishment disguised as logic. I called him again. This time there was no delay in my decision, but there was delay in his answer, and that delay carried an entirely different weight than before. Before, it felt like hesitation. Now it felt like consequence reaching both ends of the line at once. When he answered, there was no attempt to disguise anything anymore. Not fully, not cleanly. The voice I heard was still his, but it was no longer protected by the illusion of normal conversation. It had already crossed into a different state, one where truth is no longer something you manage carefully, but something you survive moment by moment. I did not ask him anything at first, because I already knew the questions had changed. Instead, I said his name. And sometimes a name carries more meaning than an entire sentence, depending on how it is spoken. He understood immediately. There was a long silence between us, and in that silence I felt something I was not prepared for. Not distance this time, but shared awareness, the kind that happens when two people realize they are no longer discussing an event, but standing inside its unfolding. And then he spoke. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to break the illusion that this was something I could manage from the outside. What he told me was not simple, and I will not dress it in dramatic language, because it did not feel dramatic in the moment. It felt precise, structured, like something that had been building in stages long before I became aware of it. There were decisions made without me. There were pressures he had carried alone longer than I had understood. There were consequences already in motion that could not be undone simply by awareness. And the most painful part was not the situation itself. It was the fact that he had tried to handle it alone. Because that is what changes everything between a parent and a child. Not the problem, the silence chosen to protect you from it. At some point during the conversation, I realized I was no longer speaking to him the way I usually do. I was listening differently. Not to fix, not to respond, but to understand the shape of what he had been carrying. And I heard something in him that I will not forget. Not fear alone, not confusion, something more complicated, responsibility he had taken too early, and isolation he had accepted too quietly. There was a moment when his voice cracked slightly, just enough that he tried to correct it immediately, as if even that small fracture of emotion was something he had trained himself to hide. And that was the moment I felt my own promise collapse internally, not in action, but in meaning. Because I realized I had promised him I would not cry, believing strength meant stability. But what he needed was not a mother who never breaks. He needed one who understands when breaking is part of staying connected. I told him I was here, not as reassurance, as reality. Because sometimes people do not need comfort as much as they need confirmation that they are no longer carrying everything alone. And then came the part I was not ready for, the part that shifted everything from emotional difficulty into something far more serious. He told me what was coming next. Not hypothetically, not vaguely, but specifically enough that the future suddenly stopped feeling like a distant concept and started feeling like a sequence already beginning to unfold. And I realized in that moment that my role was no longer passive. I was not observing, I was inside it now. And there is a different kind of fear that comes with that realization. Not the fear of loss itself, but the fear of timing, of whether you are already too late to change anything meaningful, of whether your arrival into the situation is support or simply witness. I asked him what he needed from me, and he did not answer immediately. That pause again. But this one was different. It wasn't hesitation. It was restraint. Because I could hear him choosing between what he wanted to say and what he believed I could carry without breaking alongside him. And that is when I understood the deepest truth of all. He was still protecting me, even now, even here, even when he was the one who needed protection, and something inside me refused that structure, not out of control, but out of necessity. I told him, firmly, quietly, that he did not get to decide what I can or cannot hold anymore. That whatever he is facing, we face it together now. Not because I have all the answers, but because isolation is no longer an option. And for the first time in the entire conversation, there was a shift in his breathing. Not relief, not resolution, something closer to release, as if part of him had been waiting for permission to stop standing alone. After the call ended, I did not move for a long time again. But this silence was different from before. It was no longer uncertainty. It was alignment. I still did not have all the details. I still did not know how this would unfold. But I was no longer outside the reality of it. I was inside it with him. And then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in a way I cannot ignore. The second message I had avoided reading earlier. It was no longer just information. It was instruction. And what it suggested made me realize that the next step was not emotional anymore. It was immediate, practical, irreversible in its direction. My hands are steady as I tell you this now, but not because I am calm. Because something inside me has moved past shock into decision. And I understand now why he said my name like that. It was not a warning for me to stop. It was a signal that the moment had already started, and I am running out of time to stay on the outside of it. Because what is coming next is not something I can delay anymore. And I have to decide what I am willing to risk stepping into, right now. I want to tell you that after everything, there was a clean ending, a moment where the world made sense again and the fear dissolved neatly into relief. But life rarely offers that kind of closure when emotions have already crossed into consequence. What I found instead was something quieter, more difficult to explain, a stillness that did not feel like peace at first, but like the aftermath of a decision that cannot be reversed. I kept sitting there long after the calls ended, long after the messages were read, long after the urgency had moved from outside my body into something internal that would not leave me alone, and I realized something I had spent my entire life trying to avoid acknowledging in this exact way. Strength is not the absence of breaking. It is what you choose to do in the exact moment you realize you are already breaking and still have responsibilities that cannot wait for you to feel ready. My son is not a story I can protect by standing outside it anymore. That is the truth I had been resisting since the first message arrived. And I think many people live inside that same illusion without noticing it. Believing love means distance from pain. Believing care means control, believing that if you hold yourself steady enough, nothing around you will collapse. But what I have learned in this moment, in this very real and unfinished emotional space, is that connection is not about preventing storms. It is about deciding whether you will walk into them together when they arrive, even if you are afraid, even if you are unprepared, even if everything inside you is telling you to stay in the safety of what you already understand. I think about that promise I made to him, the promise not to cry, and I understand it differently now. It was never about tears. It was about perception, about whether my emotions would become a burden instead of a bridge. But I see now that hiding emotion does not protect anyone from pain. it only hides the path through it. And sometimes the people we love do not need us to be unshakable. They need us to be reachable, present, willing to step into the same uncertainty without pretending we are immune to it. There are moments in life where you realize you are no longer preparing for what might happen. You are responding to what is already in motion. And in those moments, identity changes quietly. You stop being someone who observes from a distance and become someone who participates in the outcome. That shift is not dramatic on the outside, but internally it rearranges everything you thought you understood about control, timing, and safety. I still do not have all the answers. I may not have them for a while. And I am learning to accept that uncertainty does not mean failure, even though everything in us is trained to believe that clarity is the only acceptable form of resolution. But I have something else now that matters more than certainty. I have alignment. I am no longer outside of what is happening to him. I am inside it with him. And that changes the way every next step will be taken. If you are listening to this, I want you to understand something I had to learn in the hardest possible way. There are relationships that do not ask you to stay strong in isolation. They ask you to stay honest in connection. There are moments when silence feels like protection, but truth becomes the only way forward that does not slowly distance you from the people you love. And there are times when being needed is not about having answers, but about refusing to disappear emotionally when things become uncomfortable. I don't know what comes next in full detail yet. I only know that I will not face it alone anymore, and neither will he. And maybe that is the real ending I was never expecting to find in all of this. Not resolution, but presence. Not control, but commitment. Not certainty, but willingness. And if there is one thing I want to leave with you, it is this. You do not need permission to show up for what matters most. Not later. Not when everything is clear. Now.